Instructional Consultant at the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching at UK, and I'm joined by Stephen Kruger, the Affordable Course Content Librarian at the University of Kentucky. Thank you for joining us today for the panel on Open Educational Resources, or OERs. We're joined today by 5 panelists who have all been recipients of the OER Grant Program. And we're going to talk a little bit about why folks decided to create OERs, the process of that creation, and some things for folks to consider if they're thinking about undertaking the endeavor of creating an OER. So I'd like to give Stephen a chance to introduce himself, and then I will introduce our panelists.
Sorry, I'm also keeping an eye on the waiting room. Um, I am, the reason I'm appreciative of all of you attending is that I'm the Affordable Course Content Librarian for the University of Kentucky. And so what this panel is going to be is 5 people who are recipients of our OER Grant Program, which is a program that I manage and directly support all of the projects. Um, and so I think Kate is going to ask me questions basically as needed about how the program works on sort of the what I think of as back of house from my days in food service, but mostly we'll be centering the voices of these OER authors.
Yes, thank you so much. So our panelists today, we have Kera B. Ackerman, who is an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Early Childhood, Special Education, and Counselor Education in the College of Education at UK. Her research focuses on effective teaching practices for in-service and pre-service teacher education, and she specifically focuses on evidence-based and high-leverage practices in applied settings with individuals with learning and behavior disorders. We have Juan Fernandez-Cantero, who is a lecturer in the Department of Hispanic Studies. He specializes in teaching Spanish for the professions. Melanie Goan is a UK professor of history, director of undergraduate studies, and director of the UK Blue 3+3 BA to Law program. Her research interests in teaching focus include the 20th century US history, Kentucky history, gender, and the history of healthcare. Priscila Llamosa is an assistant clinical professor at the College of Social Work. Her scholarship focuses on using open pedagogical strategies to increase epistemic justice, the relationships between open and critical pedagogies, and their effects on engagement and belonging among students and social work practitioners of minoritized identities. Winter Phong is an assistant professor of arts administration at UK, specializing in community-based arts and practice engagement. She employs ideas for change, expanding opportunities for participation, representation, and recognition while removing barriers to ensure accessibility and sustainability. Her ongoing work focuses on supporting her disability community through arts engagement while exploring technology, financial management, and fundraising and arts administration. So we have about an hour and quite a few questions. So I'm going to do our best, or my best, to keep us kind of moving through that. And with that in mind, I'd like to start by asking our panelists to describe their OER project, kind of like you're giving an elevator pitch.
I'll go ahead and jump in first. So my OER project is a companion piece to a text. I'm all about low-cost resources for students, not reinventing the wheel when it doesn't need to be reinvented. So I have a text and I have it with me because I always butcher the title of this book. I don't know why. I've been using it for years. Successful Fundraising for Arts and Cultural Organizations. The most recent edition was published in 1996. So there's a lot of things missing within the realm of technology. There's a lot of great foundational information in this book, but because there's been so many shifts and changes, if we think about the development of the internet, and really the launch of it in 1996 specifically, there's a lot of information that's missing. So I specifically wanted to create a companion piece that really looked at topics within innovative technology, things that we've sort of moved forward with, and those things are constantly changing, so a little bit hard to keep a handle on in the short term. So I created a series of chapters that are companion pieces and plan to continue working on it as those things come up and things change.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy to go next. My piece is an orientation book, pretty much. So I developed a manual that helps to orient new students coming into the Doctor of Social Work program, not only to academics, but to doctoral studies in general. PhD programs are centered on mentorship with a faculty member, and Doctor of Social Work programs are not. They have a very different dynamic, and part of that socialization into academics sometimes gets lost, or there's some mysticism behind it. And so I decided to create a book companion for students in the Introduction to Doctoral Studies in our DSW program, Doctor of Social Work program, and it's called it's a handbook is what I call it, a handbook for the recently admitted, a nod there to um, a famous filmmaker. So that's the piece. I used some collaboration, which we'll talk about later, with staff and former and current students in the program to sort of center their voices. And it's a two-part iteration. The first part's been published, and I'm hoping to work on a second half of the book later this year.
Wonderful. Thank you. Melanie, would you like to go next?
Sure. My project is really more of a classic textbook for a course that was in need of a textbook. There was one available. It's about this thick. It's more of an encyclopedia. The class is called Making of Modern Kentucky. And for years, I had kind of cobbled together different readings, but it was cumbersome for students to move through the course. It's a big lecture class, 300 students. So I needed something that was streamlined, easy to use. And when I went into it, I thought one thing. I thought I was envisioning something like a course reader, but an electronic version, kind of like what you used to get at Johnny Print, if you remember. What I ended up doing was writing a text. So it turned into a much bigger project. But I've used it once in this Making a Modern Kentucky class, and plan to use it again. And hopefully other people throughout the state will have access to it as well.
Thank you. Juan, would you like to tell us about your project?
Yeah, I created I've almost created textbook as well for my 300 level class Spanish for the professions, business Spanish, and it's a textbook. I found that there were little um, choice in that area. The available textbooks were very expensive and outdated. Most of the materials that I would find for that course um, uh, were not the way I liked them. I had a vision for my class that I made out of looking at different textbooks, speaking to other colleagues that teach also Spanish for the professions, and I had a vision of what I wanted to do, and I wasn't happy with the existing materials, so I created this textbook, and yeah, that's my project.
Thank you. Kara?
Hi, yeah. So what I've done is I created a textbook for it's an intro to characteristics of learners who have mild to moderate disabilities. And so the reason why I was focusing on this was my class, I've taught this class for multiple years, and there just really wasn't a textbook that covered only that content. The textbooks always cover the characteristics and then how do you teach them and how do you assess them and how do you so I was finding myself using 3 chapters of a textbook that was 15 chapters long, and it just didn't seem cost effective for my students. And so what I'm doing is I'm calling it a textbook. It's going to probably end up being a little bit more like a resource, but in my mind, I need to think of it as a textbook because that's what I'm used to. And so I'm writing it as chapters. And each chapter is they align with the modules that I've developed on Canvas. which is kind of making me shift what I'm putting into Canvas as accessible for my students. I'm actually now putting that into the chapters of the textbook so that they have it long after they don't have access to the Canvas shell anymore. And sort of also like what Melanie said, I'm hoping that folks across the state will be able to use it. I have colleagues at University of Louisville who teach a similar course, and so they're excited about this too because they'll be able to access it and use it with their students.
Great. Thank you all so much. Our next question is about why you've chosen to create an OER and like what sort of needs you are meeting. And I want to acknowledge that we've already talked about accessibility of materials, the cost of materials. Sometimes it sounds like the books or materials are outdated, and so updating those, or maybe they don't exist at all. Are there other reasons that you want to draw attention to for creating an OER?
Well, something I didn't realize going in was how nice it would be to be able to put in all kinds of bells and whistles into my text to make it more interactive. And that was something, Stephen, I will say, I went in, like I said, I was going to do the electronic version of a Johnny print reader. And the first meeting, Stephen was like, well, yeah, and I think he was in a different place than I was, but very quickly I saw how much potential this had to be really engaging and take students beyond. I've kind of set it up so there's levels, like if someone just wants to do the bare minimum, they can do that. But there's all these other things that they can go further. And I've been able to put all that into this textbook in a way that I think it, hopefully for students who really are curious, there's a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll share a couple of things. Ask any of my students, and they'll say, Dr. Phong loves an activity. So I think a lot of textbooks are set up, or a lot of books are set up for here's a lot of information, and then at the very end of a chapter or very end of a section, you'll have like, here's some questions to think. Or they might send you on to doing something. And I think when I like to create something that's a little bit more sustainable that then students can sort of carry on with them. And the practice is called open pedagogy. So it's sort of this idea of this what's referred to as a renewable assignment. So something that somebody could come back to and do again. And so there's the way that the book is organized is that there's really solid connection between parts. So for me, because of the way that I teach and because of the way that I like information to be accessible to students beyond the time that they're in my course, or people in the industry or other teachers, that there's an opportunity to sort of engage with those materials in a different way. So they could do just the activity, or they could present the content and the activity together. But I really wanted to create flexibility within how things were put together. And so that was something that was sort of really important. One, how do we carry this information into the industry? Because some of the things are new or changing. One of those things being artificial intelligence. And my field has we'll say, contentious relationship sometimes with AI around intellectual property in particular and copyright. And so having something that creates a space to be critical, have conversations around, presents an activity for people to do, as well as potentially help them evaluate as companies are opening up artificial intelligence opportunities to them. What are things that I need to do or think about? Are practices that are really important to understand. And I think having that available to read and understanding that it's a renewable resource that students can come back to, people in the industry can come and look at it and see what are the new things that are being discussed or talked about, was something that's really important to me to make sure that there's that open dialogue within my industry.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what Kara was saying about, if you've compiled these resources in your Canvas course, but then once the student is no longer enrolled, whether or not they would still have access to that. And it sounds like these OERs are a good way to provide that longevity of the resources. So now I want to think about if you could describe what the process was like for you creating these OERs. For instance, what were your expectations versus the reality of the process?
I can talk to that just a little bit because Stephen talked me down, which was great. Because I went in thinking I'm going to create this, I'm going to get this all ready. It's going to be all the chapters, which in my mind is sort of like modules, like each week. So each week I'm going to have it all done. And Stephen was like, why don't you try starting with just one or two chapters? And so I have one totally finished and, out the door, it's clean. And the other one is like 85% finished and I'm still doing some final little tweaks on it. So it took a lot longer than what I was expecting it to take. Another panelist mentioned about adding in like the bells and whistles and things that can be part of this. That was something that took me a lot longer than I thought it was going to take me. I spent a lot of time going in and looking at and playing with the different resources. Like there are places for the press books is what I'm using press books as mine. There are places that I can put in questions. I can embed a timeline that the students can scroll through. And so one of the pieces of content in the first chapter is the timeline of some federal laws that impact special education. And so they're able to go in and like scroll through that timeline and see each amendment and what happened, what changed with the federal law for each of those amendments. So there's lots of little things like that that took a lot more time than I was expecting.
I want to echo Melanie and Kera as well. How important is meeting with Stephen and their guidance. He talked me down to he advised me to be less ambitious and more realistic. And I took that piece of advice and it went very well. And I also like the idea they gave me about having a fresh start, being let my imagination go wild because of the format um, of putting it online, creating online resources, and the how open to different formats or different ways of expression that can be. And it helped me a lot meeting with Stephen in so many ways. And also, I like that Stephen encouraged me when I presented to them my original idea, which was writing the text with the idea of generative AI. That was one of my original ideas. He didn't discourage me. He let me do my thing, but I thought that if I had to do that, I would first research very well about the topics that I wanted to include and um, sources that I needed to know before writing prompts for the machine to write. And I also wanted to. I thought that generative AI would be a great tool for writing text in Spanish because it can be very conscious of the level of the language that I wanted to use. But then I realized that maybe that wouldn't be the best idea, and I wrote it myself without the help of. I think generative AI is the best thing to do when writing. I don't think, or from my point of view, generative AI is not a good tool for writing. It can be good for generating ideas and which helped in the process, but not specifically for writing a textbook. So I wrote it myself. I had already done all of the research that I needed to do. Um, and then I thought, do I want this written by a machine under my name? Definitely not. I don't want that. I don't want to have my name associated with something that I haven't actually written. Plus, I've done all the work. So um, that's something that marked the way I approached this OER project and how it changed over time for me, and the scope or the way I approach it.
Thank you. That does sound like a big shift from AI is going to help to I'm doing this all by myself.
Monica, I see your hand up. If you want to put your question in the chat, we're going to do some questions, question and answer later. So keep rolling with the questions going on now, but you can certainly put the question in the chat if you want.
Thank you, Jill. My next question for the panelists is about how collaboration played a role in your project. You've all talked about how helpful meeting with Stephen was. I'm curious about other types of collaboration in your projects.
Hi, so I used collaboration, I think, in a non-traditional way. I wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, get perspectives from past and current students and from some of the staff in the College of Social Work. I thought that it would be very important to sort of center their voices and say, okay, what were their experiences like? Also to highlight some of the resources that are available. For example, I had reached out to one of our staff members in the College of Social Work, our wellness program coordinator, to write about self-care. You know, self-care being extremely important for all of us, and particularly for those, starting their doctoral journey. And she was able to not only write great content, but also add resources that could be accessed and that can be also changed over time if we need to, hence the nature of an OER. I also used quotes. It was really cool. I sent out a survey. I created a survey with, I think, Google Forms, and I sent it out to several students and alumni and asked them to provide, one or two sentences about a handful of topics. They could choose which one, and several people responded, and I was able to use them as quotes in the related chapters, which I think is really cool for the reader, for the students to sort of relate to other students and alumni. And another thing that I wanted to make sure, because of the nature of my project, being an OER and having been funded, by the library, I also wanted to highlight library services. So I reached out to our College of Social Work library liaison and asked her to put up some content. And she had a whole chapter, which is my favorite chapter in the book. So many resources, so many interesting ideas, and it's there, not just for this course that the book is used for in the Introduction to Doctoral Studies, but that students can access throughout their entire program. Go and say, what was that link again? Or what was that resource again? And they can go back and access that. And again, we can update it as we go along. Now, one thing that I will say about collaboration is some of it was easier than I thought, and some of it was harder than I thought. So, when reaching out to other people for a quote or a little, content bite that you can incorporate is one thing, because you send out a survey, you might have to send a couple other emails reminding people, and they email it back, and you have the material right there. Working in real time with other folks, they're busy people. They have busy schedules like we all do. And so that required a whole other approach, in terms of reaching out and then reminding them and then reminding them again. And some people are great at getting back to you right away and some are not. So I would say if you're planning on using collaboration, especially if your collaborators or contributors are writing larger sections of your project, definitely built in extra time, more than you think you're going to need, to be able to get those responses back and incorporate them into your project. Aside from collaboration, if you need any kind of departmental level approval, even if they're just looking at it at the end and saying, oh yeah, this is great, or giving you general feedback, I would say also build in more time. So whatever date you want to have this project finished, work back about a month, and then to allow that extra few weeks for your department to take a look at it, give you feedback, or do whatever they need to do as well. So being realistic, which again, shout out to Stephen for keeping us in a very realistic type of schedule. Working with Stephen was really amazing and helpful and vital to my project.
I know you mentioned working closely with content librarians. Kara, I believe you also had experience with this during your project.
I did, yeah. I was looking for specifically images that I could embed into the chapter. And so finding those images and making sure that they were, open, I don't know the terminology. Stephen, you'll have to help me with the terminology, but making sure that I was allowed to use them and cite them properly. So I did, Stephen directed me to the correct librarians, and that was super helpful. Just to get those like historical photos that I needed, like signing of the law, images of children before we allowed children in schools, children with disabilities in public schools. So that was the kind of thing I was looking for.
Great, thank you. My next question is about, we've talked about the process and collaborating along the way, and I want to think about the quote unquote finished project. What was the final version? Was it what you had expected it to be or what you'd hoped it to be? How did that kind of change over time? Melanie, I think we talked a little bit about this before. Would you like to talk about the being finished?
Yeah, sure. And I'm not completely finished. My plan, and I was pretty unreasonable because I went into this, like I said, I thought I was doing one thing, decided to do another, but I was committed to using it in the fall. And so I started about April of last year and needed it to be ready by August. And I was writing right till the end of the course and didn't quite get it done. But the parts that students used, which was about 8 chapters of this textbook, seemed to really work. And I wouldn't say, I got like gushing feedback a lot of times. And I had asked students, like if you find any typos or comments you want to make, I gave them a way to do that. And I didn't hear anything from them. But sometimes I take no news is good news. On the course evaluations, it seemed that they really appreciated a book that was written specifically for them, for their needs. It was relevant, it was up to date. They were as positive as I would say students usually get about a textbook. But I felt like it was a success. And I'm excited to teach the course again, which is really important. I needed that kind of boost, I think.
Can I say one more thing about collaboration really quick?
Of course.
So something that I did, my very first page of the text, like the intro part, I put a link to a Qualtrics survey where, people could, if they find an error or if they find a better resource or, so it's just really kind of open like that they can send me a message through this Qualtrics survey because it is kind of always going to be a changing, morphing, it's never really going to be finished kind of product. It's going to be something that will continue to be edited. And so I did add that into the very beginning that I think will be helpful in the future. So far, nobody's filled out my Qualtrics survey, but I'm hopeful that somebody will.
And
I wanted to add, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Juan. Go ahead.
I wanted to add something about the finished product and collaboration. One of my ideas was having my students collaborate in the creation of the book, of the textbook. But since it happened to me similar to Melanie, that I started early in April, May to write the documents of the texts, but I didn't had it ready for the class. I was writing and working on it at the same time. And I wasn't able to involve my students the way I wanted them to be involved in that project. And I also didn't have the time to research about permissions for have their work on this open educational resource. But definitely, since this kind of projects are long time, they can keep being updated and they should be updated regularly. I still think that I want to do that in the future, working with my students, having them maybe collaborate with the glossary or creating some questions for ancillaries or the materials that they may use in the future. It's something that Stephen gave me that idea, and I haven't discarded yet. But I think it's very very useful and valuable, and talking about collaboration.
While we're on that note, Winter, could I point out one question that sort of on this thread that was pointed towards you in the chat? Monica asks, I was intrigued by your statement that the industry businesses would be able to read and comment on your textbook. Why would this happen and in what contexts?
Sure, I can sort of jump in. So when it's finished, we'll put quotes around finished. Right now I'm sort of doing one more edit, and I've done a soft launch with my students and gotten, sort of their engagement and understanding how they're using it. But in terms of presentations or conference presentations or engaging with industry, my field is very closely connected to industry. So a lot of the people who will come and do our conferences are people who actually work specifically in research and planning. I also work closely with state arts agencies, as well as I have folks at the NEA that I hang out with, the National Endowment for the Arts. So we're a little bit closer connected because we're so small. So there's easily an opportunity for me to share the link of this text with people who are working in industry, and our students go out, and the majority of them do go right into working in the industry, and will share the resources or things that they worked through in their study with us. As well as my undergraduates look at this, my graduate students look at this, depending on the course that I'm teaching. And they're of course welcome to share it. So there's a little bit more opportunity within my field to make that connection and to have that opportunity to share that product. And I've also had conversation with other people who are interested in, maybe something specific like AI, or, hey, I've been marketed this thing. And I can be like, hey, here's this resource of things to think about and to learn about so that you feel educated and informed about making that decision. Just because we're good at sharing and talking to each other. And some of the conferences that I go to are industry specific as well as academic. And that's just a line we toe in my field often.
Thank you, Winter. Would you also like to talk about positive aspects of this type of writing and the platform that you're using and what it means to you to be finished?
So like I said, I've soft launched the project in my classes. And I've definitely seen an improvement in student knowledge retention for this format and this style, and that sort of coincides with my experience teaching. I've been teaching for quite a long time. I've only been at UK for a short time, but teaching at the college level for, I think I'm coming up on 20 years. And so the long experience of working with, different college students, different level of experience, and found that the knowledge retention has been pretty strong. Within these, the students do better on what I call knowledge checkups that are low stakes quizzes, and they retake them less and also get more answers correct the first time that they do take it, if they do take it more than once, and they engage with the material a little bit better. And so I think that's, a combination of one, how my class is designed, and then two, the interest in the particular subject matter. So understanding that those topics could change over time means that I can come in and edit and adapt based on the needs of the course. I can add chapters that not everybody's going to have assigned, but still fit into the broader topic as I'm sort of moving through and potentially teaching other things. So I like the adaptability. That's not for everybody. It could be a closed-end project for some people. For me, it remains open-ended because it's an industry that's constantly in flux and change. And the practice of fundraising is being impacted by choices that are made at the policy level, federal level, state level, individual choices, different options that become available because of technology, helping people understand big data. Those are all different things. And I've got a list of chapters that I want to continue to work on as I sort of develop this. And so I think for me, the notion of finished is both exciting and might be daunting for some people. But I've specifically designed the project in a way that it allows for continued update and change or adaptability. And I love sharing activity. I love an activity. my students will swear by it. And then creating activities that, potentially whoever might be engaged, and I adapt them for people who aren't necessarily in my coursework and who might want to do those things, and finding ways for them to explore, experiment, work on their professional development. So it's, I like the idea of teaching all people the things that I might know or have experience in, and wanting to share that openly with people who, may never be a student of mine, but absolutely want to benefit from that, or potentially could become a student of mine because they encountered that. And my work is through Pressbooks, which I found is, pretty standard, like chapter setup, but you can sort of organize and include multimedia if you would like. And so that's been sort of helpful in the design and creativity, but still familiarity for the type of text or writing that somebody might expect to see.
So Pressbooks will let you put things in a chapter format, but I know folks have also talked about some of these bells and whistles that Stephen has introduced you all to. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about advice for somebody thinking about undertaking the process and understanding the differences in maybe the chapters versus all of the bells and whistles.
So if I can
Oh,
just
go ahead. Please go ahead, Priscilla.
I just want to add something real quick, because it piggybacks on what we were just talking about. I think thinking about what type of project you want to do in terms of, will it be ever done? Would it be like an open and close project? Is it something that you are planning on coming back and altering or adding content over time? I think having a very clear understanding of what you want this to look like right at the beginning as you are conceptualizing your project is really, really important. I thought I had a good understanding of what I wanted my project to look like. And then I met with Stephen and was able to just talk through it. And they were able to tell me, okay, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Because depending on what you want out of your project, even the type of, like, the platform, whether it be Pressbooks or some other platform, that will depend on the type of project. It's not the other way around. And so sort of creating a clear-ish view of what it is that you want and the longevity of your project. At the beginning, if you don't know, sort of talking through that, maybe with Stephen before you even put in your application, right, for the grant, would be really helpful. And it's okay if you don't know. I knew very little about OERs, and I feel like I learned a ton over this process, because that's part of it. Doing our homework, right, is part of the project itself. So even if you don't know, it's okay.
Thank you.
I was going to say something very similar, to just make sure that Stephen will work with you to identify. He'll, show you different examples of various, resources. I'm also using Pressbooks, and I sort of dove in with the writing part of it, and I kind of wish I would have spent more time looking at the bells and whistles and the different ways that I could embed activities within the chapter itself. So like I had mentioned before, I put in a timeline. I discovered that after I had written the chapter, and then I went back and added it. So, spending that time up front to get to know the platform that you're using, I think is probably where I went wrong and wish I would have done a little bit differently.
I think one of the key points is if you have a Stephen, find a Stephen. If you're not at UK and you don't have Stephen, Stephen has a great network, and A will connect you to that to find who that person might be. The OER network is pretty solid, and it continues to grow and expand. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to connect with different people. As everybody said, do your research, figure out, what I think I spent time looking at like 4 or 5 different platforms, going, which one's right for this project? And I've done OER. I've had a couple of OER projects in the past and used a completely different setup, because it depends on like, who's the audience, who are you talking to, what's the purpose? of the text. And I think understanding those, even if you don't know what the end product is exactly going to look like, if you understand that, that'll help be a guiding principle as you're starting to think about taking on one of these projects or sort of developing those things. And then really thinking about how you're going to be using it or how somebody else might be using it in the future, because you're going to be interested and dedicated to working on it and finding motivation if you know that you're going to be using it in the future as well, or connecting people with that resource. It's going to keep you motivated to work on it, and it becomes somewhat of a personal project. Not that all things aren't necessarily personal, but something that you're really invested in making successful. And I think that's important for staying invested in the project and continuing to move forward with it. I think also writing takes time, editing takes even longer. So keeping those things in mind as you're sort of preparing, getting a chance to have feedback, planning those in. Again, if you're not working with Stephen and at another institution, there might be a little bit of work and negotiation to manage that process. But if you're at UK or and applying for one of those grants, know that you're going to have that support. And those regular check-ins, which are very helpful to say, what's the progress? Where are you going? What do you want to be working on? Did you discover something different in this process? And I think even if you have like a solid idea of something and have done OERs before, things change. And I think that having the understanding and grace with yourself to go, okay, yeah, it's shifting this way because I'm actually finding this is more important, or I want to build in collaboration, or I want to have some type of other aspect incorporated. I think that creating the space for that is really important, or being prepared for change to happen is good.
I feel like that's all really good advice. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Well, one thing I discovered along the way, I expected writing would take time and learning the platform would take time, which was really not as challenging as I expected it to be, and Stephen was very helpful. But the other thing that I wasn't accounting for was the things that you have to do to make it truly open and accessible. And so I, for instance, use some primary sources for history students to work with, and making those so you can hear them out loud, spoken, and just taking the things that I wanted to incorporate and doing the extra thing to make it accessible. You have to account for that too as you're thinking about time. And I think, Monica, you asked about, I've not published textbooks per se, but I've published other academic books, and working with a press is different than what you're doing here. You have to come up with your own cover art, for instance. I've never done that before, which is nice. It gives you complete creative control, but also just there's some extra to it.
Okay, well, we have about 15 minutes left, so I do want to leave some time for questions. I see, Jill, you have asked a question for Stephen in the chat if we wanted to start there, which is, what other platforms do you tend to recommend in addition to Pressbooks?
Well, sort of coincidentally, and not entirely coincidentally, I think everyone here is using Pressbooks. And everyone is using it in different ways, which I really like. Some people are doing what I think of as book-shaped objects in a pretty traditional sense. Some people are I did want to give full credit to the authors here for like someone mentioned that I had pointed them at the bells and whistles. I don't think that's actually true for most of you. I think a lot of you know a lot more about the details of what Pressbooks can do right now than I do. And I know other UK authors with access to that platform do as well, because like I know about some of it, and I may know that some of these things exist because I've seen other books do them, but I like Kara, I can look up how to put a timeline into Pressbooks. I don't know off the top of my head. I didn't tell you about that tool. So I really enjoyed seeing people really run with the platform in ways that I didn't expect them to do. And like really taking advantage of how varied it can be, even within one pretty conventional digital book style format. Like people are really embracing what you can do with that. So we use Pressbooks mostly because we do have an institutional subscription to it through our state consortium, and it's a solid platform for book-shaped objects. Occasionally, I will point someone towards Manifold, which is a different platform that can do ebooks, and I tend to use it more for things where that are like a collection of resources. Something not through the grant project, but through OER we've published here recently is a collection of ancillary materials like notes, syllabi, test banks, etc., for a data structures and algorithms course where I worked with an emeritus faculty to just openly license and publish in Manifold materials from classes he had recently taught. But like that worked better because it was a bunch of different things that people could download rather than something that needed to fit like a sort of cohesive book structure in the way that all these projects are. Um, Another thing, I think Priscilla actually put it really nicely in that the platform should be driven by what the project is intended to be rather than vice versa. And so Pressbooks is an easy one. Manifold is there for some types of projects, but I also leave it open to if someone has a different platform that they want to use that would meet the qualifications, like this needs to be open access, this needs to be publicly available, this needs to be able to meet basic accessibility standards. If someone has a different tool that they want to use, then great. I probably can't provide the same kind of support for it, but I have another grantee who's not on this panel who's using GitHub because he's an information science professor, and that's the platform that he is used to using and has used before. I also encourage people to, usually in addition to whatever platform they're using, to put a version of it in our institutional repository. So it's their complicated whether institutional repositories count as preservation platforms, but they count as that more than Pressbooks does. So like I know Priscilla uploaded a version of the book into UK Knowledge, which is our IR here. So we have the platforms that I point people towards if they don't have something already in mind, but I'm also completely open to people using something else if they want to.
Related follow-up in the chat from Monica. Has anyone used Fulcrum? Stephen, are you familiar with Fulcrum? Okay.
Not that I know of, and this is another example of people keep mentioning occasionally platforms that I have never heard of. And so it's not just like Pressbooks is one of the most widely used ones, Manifold's increasingly popular, but like there's also a lot of other options out there. So I will go look that one up and maybe add to the list. I know PubPub is out there as well, and they all have different pros and cons, and they're all for different types of work.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a question, which is a lot of the panelists have talked about students either getting their feedback on the OER or even as having them as partners in authoring OERs. Are there sort of any guidelines or rules around students as collaborators for OERs?
That is a slightly complicated question, I think.
Okay.
And that it depends heavily on what type of collaboration. So I'll put a link in the chat after I'm done talking, but another project that we have done before is that we published last year and we're now working on part two is entirely student written. So it's not a textbook in the conventional sense, but each chapter is a student essay. It's for a history of design course for architecture, and it is for so each student had to do an essay on a site that they were assigned, and so as part of this project, they also had to find openly licensed or public domain images of their site to embed in their chapter, or sometimes create their own drawings or photographs of the work. And so for that one, like we have like basically same as any other author, like the students are creating the work, they own the copyright. We needed to make sure that we were posting it legally. So for something like that, where we are actually publishing work that students own the rights to, then for that, like we have an author permissions form. And so that one, it's one much more intensive type of student authorship and collaboration. For things like the feedback of students on the process or on the work that's just going directly to the professor, that's a lot more open because we're not publishing their own work. So it really depends on the kind of collaboration.
I appreciate the clarification. Totally open to taking more questions from attendees. If you feel comfortable unmuting and asking questions, that's totally fine. Or you can continue to put them in the chat.
I'd like to just give a shout out to CELT because CELT was very helpful in my project. I met with them early on. I met with Ashley Sorrell, Jennifer Pulsatani, I think is her name, and they looked through the materials and gave me some really good suggestions on how to just kind of wayfinding for students, making it more user friendly. And so that was helpful to have them as advisors in the format and the function of it.
Wonderful. I have wonderful colleagues at CELT, so I'm not surprised that they were helpful.
I can build on that a little bit, actually, as long as we're waiting for questions about the long-term collaboration we have with CELT around this. And this is kind of advice for people who are in my type of role, who are doing the support for OER. Find your campus partners within the library and without. So that goes from, let's see, at some point, Juan asked me about like the licensing for a data representation tool he was using. And I love being able to say we have a librarian for that and then making it their problem. And sometimes that's like, how do I cite this thing? I don't know. Here is your subject liaison. Kara gave a good example of like looking for images of like specific historical events, and I was able to point her to the history liaison. And so for one, I sent him to the data librarian. But CELT has been really great in both specific consultations, like the one Melanie mentioned, to the point where like I'm actually going to start folding that into the process of like very, very strongly recommending from day one with new grantees that like they schedule meetings with CELT to talk about like things that I don't actually have the training to do in from the instructional design side. But also like the partnership of like hosting this panel is indicative of what we're trying to do here as well, and keeping this a big picture as well as sort of a project focused collaboration. So we have this grant process operates through we have a selection committee that's an advisory board. A couple of people here are rotating onto it. And it's mostly people apply, and a working group within the library that I lead selects them based on largely based on representation from different departments. But we always have a CELT member, and that's not something we select. Like Kate is actually rotating on to replace Trey, who is also in the audience here. But like it is up to CELT who they assign to that, but it's just there will always be a member of that office on this committee to be really actively participating in the projects.
Yes.
Actually, if I could raise a question, maybe for Priscila. You mentioned how difficult it was to do the editing. And I am finding I'm writing a textbook that is about 800 pages and about 800 illustrations. And when I was working with textbook publishers, editors would be going through each line and asking me if the content was correct and if the clarity was there. And various people have been looking at the chapters I've written, and nobody's giving it that kind of professional attention because this is obviously not supported by a team of professionals. What sort of suggestions does the group have for getting feedback to make sure that it's what you're writing is what is going to be in touch with what students need?
I found really useful talking again about CELT, but the midterm consultation that I had with one of CELT consultants with Mike was really useful for me. Having him come to my class, talk to my students, have a custom-made survey for them. That helped me a lot in the process of writing and knowing if things were going right, were going wrong, or were what room I had for improvement.
Yeah, so Juan is talking about our mid-semester feedbacks, where a Celtic will come to a class and facilitate a conversation with students about the things that are working, and if there are suggestions, but definitely adding questions about feedback specific to the OER is something that can be added into those mid-semester feedbacks very easily. So that would be a good way to get some feedback.
So I'm sorry.
I'm happy to jump in with a couple of alternatives to think about as you're sort of coming in and looking at, again, because I think, Monica, you're with a different institution. And one of the ways that you might be able to get feedback or develop a process for feedback is if you do have an OER librarian or somebody that sort of offers work, they can, and I know Stephen has certainly offered this for us, is connect us with networks that help to manage or work toward getting a peer review process happening for that specific material, and supporting us in figuring out and navigating that, as well as if you have a grant or something there's funding available, you could put into that grant to be able to pay somebody to do some type of editing or somebody within your field that can do that kind of vetting so that you have that process that you've gone through that then does the work that normally a publisher might do, and that could be something that gets written into a grant application that you are applying for.
That is super helpful, actually. And I think I really would be interested in finding out more information for you, Stephen, about that. And I'm an emeritus professor now, so I am at UK, but this is not being developed for a class. It's actually being developed for students in Africa, as well as the United States, and as well as in Europe. So it's a revision of a textbook that used to be in paper and used to be shipped in boats to Africa, as well as in classrooms in the US. So so I'm feeling very, very unprotected by the fact that I don't have that support. So I think that probably your suggestion that I go to grant organizations is a super one. And it seems that I could perhaps build on your experiences here working in classrooms and try to figure out what people would be wanting in Ouagadougou. So thank you.
I would definitely point you towards connecting with Stephen because he made clear to me that you don't have to be the recipient of a grant to get help. So definitely reach out to him. I'm sure he would be happy to connect you with these networks that Winter was talking about. I do want to be mindful of our time. We've got about 2 minutes if anyone else has any questions.
An extremely quick plug for the fact that if you are a UK professor or teaching a class here, the application process for the next grant cycle is currently open. And I do actually, as someone mentioned, I very strongly encourage people to get in touch with me before you apply, and we'll do a consultation about your project and I'll help you make that application stronger.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you all again for joining us today and learning a little bit more about OER, and would encourage everyone to reach out to Stephen and learn a little bit more about that grant and the process. So thank you again.